Good morning, everyone. So today we're going to be continuing talking about anterior teeth, and today's session is going to be about canines. Mainly, we're going to discuss the difference between all four canines, permanent ones. We're going to learn how to differentiate between left and right canines, and how to differentiate between maxillary and mandibular canines. We're going to be discussing all the anatomical features in detail today. Okay. Let's start with the quick question from last week. So we had a question about a patient giving a history of a car accident where he lost two of his lower teeth. He had ortho treatment to fill in the gaps, and the question was, how would you differentiate between if the teeth are central or lateral incisors? The answer is going to be difference in rotation of the crown to the root. Let's take each choice and talk about it. Difference in root length. Well, it's not really efficient when you're examining a patient clinically to look at the root length because you only have two teeth, the other two are missing. So how are you going to compare? Even if you take an X-ray, sometimes the teeth can be the same length. You know, there's so many exceptions that can go into it, so it's not very efficient to depend on the root length. Difference in ratio of crown to root length. We haven't really discussed anything about that the last lecture. Basically, the crown to the root length should be a little bit the same. I know the laterals are a little bit bigger, but that doesn't mean that the length is going to be different. Again, you don't have teeth to compare it with. Degree of slope of the incisal edge when viewed facially. Now, we know that the degree of the incisal edge, it kind of tilts lingually, but that's like true for all the mandibular incisors. Difference in rotation of the crown to the root. Remember how we discussed it? We discussed over here that we discussed two things. Remember two things about the mandibular laterals. The cingulum, remember how we talked about it was centered or off-centered? And you have the marginal ridge. The marginal ridge of the central incisors are equal to each other, while in the lateral incisors, the distal marginal ridge is shorter than the mesial marginal ridge. As you can see here, due to the rotation of the cingulum, as it's off-centered to the distal. That is the best criteria. You're always going to find that the lower central incisors are symmetrical, the edges are all the same, they're square, the marginal edges are the same length, cingulum is in the center. While in the lateral, it's going to be off-centered and you're going to have tilting. And the crown is shifted due to the off-centering of the cingulum. Okay, so that's the best criteria. All right, let's start with the canines today. Remember how we talked about last week the term labial ridge? So labial ridge, I told you that it's only special for the canines. Okay, so we're going to talk about that. Labial ridge, from its name, is on the labial or facial part of the tooth. The labial surface of canines is marked by a pronounced labial ridge. If you can see here, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Okay. Okay, over here. You can see in the middle, this is the labial part. And right in the middle over here, you can see that it's bumping out, right? And then you got like two little dips on the mesial and distal. So this in the middle is called the labial ridge. It's prominent, okay? And it's only confined to the maxillary, to the canines, maxillary or mandibular. Okay. It has shallow developmental depressions that lie mesial and distal to the labial ridge. Just those depressions that I showed you. Those are developmental depressions. So we got the labial ridge in the middle, and then we got developmental depressions on the mesial and the distal. It goes for the maxillary and the mandibular. Okay. On the mandibular canines, the labial ridge and developmental depressions are not as pronounced. So if you were to compare between maxillary and mandibular, the maxillary canines have a more pronounced labial ridge. The mandibular canines do have that labial ridge, but it's not as pronounced. It's not as bulky as the maxillary canines. So as the developmental depression, it's going to be a little bit shallower, while it's going to be deeper in the maxillary canines. Now, all of the canines are the only cuspid teeth which feature a functional lingual surface rather than a functional occlusal surface. This is very important to know. Okay, so when you compare the anterior teeth in general, the incisors to the canines, when you start to eat, you bite with your centrals and canine because the occlusal or the incisal edge of the centrals and the laterals are the cutting edges. It's exactly like when you bite into an apple. That's the cutting edge that's going to cut the piece of the apple out of the whole fruit. But when it comes to the canines, how they function, it's not really the incisal tip that's cutting into it more than the lingual surface. It's the most functional. It's the one that's doing all the work. Okay, so that's an important note to know. So keep it for future reference. Okay, so looking at the maxillary canine from the facial view, the distal portion of the facial surface is convex. Let's zoom in and see. The distal portion is convex. Right here, convex is it's like a bulky outside shape. And it's convex in the middle third. Right here, we can see it. It's right in the middle third, right about here, okay? And it's slightly concave in the cervical third. And then after that concavity, it kind of dips. It becomes like a concave part. So you have convexity in the middle third and then concavity in the cervical third. Okay? The mesial portion is convex in the middle third and nearly flat in the cervical third. That's going to be in the mesial part. Okay? Alrighty. From the incisal view, the cervical line is not often as visible. This is due to the convexity of the crown. So you can see over here, if we look at it from the incisal view, we can barely see the cervical line. That's because the crown of the canine is a little bit bulky, and it's bulky in all dimensions, so you won't be able to see the cervical line over here. Okay. General characteristics. Okay, now we're going to be talking in general about the maxillary and mandibular canines. The most prominent part of the labial ridge is the middle third. Is in the middle. Okay, so basically this is the most prominent part. Even if you look at the canine sideways, let me go back to the first slide. Even if you look at it sideways over here, let's look at it over here. You can see that the labial ridge is most prominent in the middle. And you see the top? Yeah, it's right there. It's most prominent. Over here in the middle, it's most prominent. Okay. The facial-lingual dimension of the maxillary and mandibular canines is greater than the mesodistal dimension. Okay, so this is another important one. This is part of why we can't see the cervical line when we look at it occlusally. So it's bulkier facial-lingually than mesodistally. Okay. Here's an interesting fact. The maxillary canine is the longest tooth in the mouth. So what I mean when I say it's the longest tooth in the mouth, it means the crown plus the root all together makes it the longest tooth in the mouth. So hence it's going to be harder to extract. It's going to have a really long root canal if a root canal was going to be done. All these things. When it comes to the mandibular canine, it's not the longest tooth in the mouth, but it has the longest crown of any permanent tooth. As you can see over here, the crown is ridiculously long. It's even longer than the maxillary canine, but the maxillary canine is still longer due to the root. When it comes to the mandibular canine, the root is a little bit shorter than the maxillary. That's why it's not the longest tooth in the mouth. The maxillary one is. And for the mandibular canine, the mesial surface of the crown of a mandibular canine is nearly parallel to the long axis of the tooth. So this is the long axis of the tooth. This is the mesial part. It's kind of parallel. You can see it's kind of flat, and it kind of goes with the long axis of the tooth. Okay? Unlike the maxillary canine, where you have a convexity and then it kind of becomes flat. Okay. Mandibular canines. This is a summary of any mandibular canine, whether it's right or left. Proximal contacts. Proximal contact of a mandibular canine on the mesial is going to be the incisal third, so it's going to contact the other tooth right here. So it's going to contact with the lateral right on the incisal third, and on the distal part right here, it's going to contact in the middle third because you know the bulkiness of the convexity, let's say, is going to be in the middle third. So realistically, it's going to contact with the first premolar in the middle third. So mesially, incisal third, distally, middle. The mesial aspect is narrower and longer than the maxillary canines. Yep, we already talked about it because there's no convexity. It's parallel to the long axis of the tooth. Flat lingual surface. Its lingual surface is relatively flat over here. Marginal ridge are parallel. Marginal ridges are parallel over here. You can see it. Where am I? Okay, and the cingulum is off-centered distally. We already know that. Incisal aspect is more symmetrical than maxillary canines. Distal cusp ridge rotated. So the incisal aspect, it's more symmetrical in general over here than the maxillary canines, and the cingulum is off-centered distally. Incisal aspect is more symmetrical, and the distal cusp ridge is rotated. Okay. So we got the distal cusp ridge is kind of rotated. Cusp is lingual to the root axis line. Remember, in the mandibular teeth, even in the incisors, that's the same concept. The cusp tip is lingual to the root axis line. Okay, so these are just like general characteristics of the mandibular canines. Let's move on to the maxillary. Okay. The proximal contacts of the maxillary canines, in the mesial part, it's going to be the junction of the incisal and middle third. When I say junction, it means somewhere between the incisal third and the middle third, right where they meet, right there in the middle. In the middle of the incisal and middle third, that's called the junction. So that's where you're going to be the mesial proximal contact, and in the distal, it's just going to be the middle third, just because of that convexity over here, like we talked about before. The mesial aspect is wider faciolingually. Okay, so in general, we said canines are wider faciolingually. That's why we can't see the cervical line when we look at it occlusally, right? Now, for the maxillary canines, specifically, the mesial aspect, it's going to be wider faciolingually. Okay? It has a deeper lingual fossa, pronounced marginal ridge, large centered cingulum, unlike the mandibular, where the lingual kind of flat, the cingulum is kind of off-centered. Incisal aspect has marked symmetry of mesial and distal halves. Okay, so this is the incisal aspect, and it has a marked symmetry of mesial and distal halves. Cusp tip may be at or labial to root axis line. So for the maxillary teeth in general, it's either going to be at the root axis line or it's going to be labial to it. It's never lingual like the mandibular teeth. That's another rule you got to keep in mind. For the mandibular teeth, it's always going, the incisal edges or the incisal tip is always going to be tipping lingually. For the maxillary, it's going to be either at the root axis line or it's going to be positioned labially. Alright. Now, maxillary canines. The curvature of the cervical line is greater on the mesial than on the distal. Okay. So the curvature of the cervical line, I did not put a picture up here, sorry. Let me go back. I will talk about it on the proximal view of the tooth. Okay. The maxillary. Okay, so the cervical line is greater on the mesial, right here is the mesial, than on the distal. You can see it, it's deeper, okay? The mesial surface is straighter than the distal surface. We already talked about that because the distal surface has that convexity in the middle third and then the concavity on the cervical third. While on the mesial surface, it's going to be flat or straighter. The distal cusp ridge is longer than the mesial cusp ridge. Okay, this is an important one because this defines where the canine tip is located. So you distal cusp ridge is longer than the mesial cusp ridge. So the cusp is kind of leaning towards the medial side because it's kind of shorter. Okay, the mesial contact point is at the junction of the incisal and middle third. We discussed that earlier. It's usually thicker labial-lingually than mesiodistally, especially the mesial part. Remember that. The tip of the cusp is displaced labially and mesial to the central long axis of the tooth. See, we already discussed that the cusp tip is displaced labially because it's a maxillary tooth, right? And why is it mesial to the central long axis of the tooth? It's because the mesial marginal ridge is shorter than the distal marginal ridge. Okay? Oh, let me rephrase. The mesial cusp ridge, not marginal ridge. Okay? This is the cusp ridge over here, where the cusp is. The marginal ridge goes down all the way to the root. Okay. The distal contact is in a more cervical position, middle of the middle third. Yeah, it's going to be in the middle. It's more cervical than the mesial contact, which is the junction of the incisal and middle third. Although the apical third of the root typically curves distal, this is not always true. Okay, so this is another thing to remember. That maxillary canine tip, as you can see here, it's tipping a little bit to the distal, the apical third, right here. But this is not always the case. Every individual differs. You got exceptions, but just keep that in mind. Okay, now, how do we distinguish between mandibular and maxillary canines? On mandibular canines, the mesial border is straighter when viewed facially. Let's see. Now, this is the mandibular, this is the mesial part, and it's more straighter. We already talked about that because on the maxillary canines, you have like a convexity going on, and then it kind of flattens out, while in the mandibular teeth, it's already kind of parallel. Contact areas are located more incisally, and in maxillary, they're the junction of the middle third. This is the incisal to the middle third. Okay, yeah, we talked about that. This is contact areas. This is confined to the mandibular canines. In maxillary, it's the junction of the the junction of the incisal and middle third. The cusp tip is displaced lingually on the mandibular canines. Remember, on the mandibular canines, it's lingual, maxillary, and labial. Whereas on the maxillary cusp, it's on the labial to the root axis line, viewed proximally and incisal when you look at it sideways and when you look at it from on top. The mandibular canine has a narrower mesiodistal dimension, so it's a little bit smaller than the maxillary canine. Remember, the maxillary, they're both wider faciolingually than mesiodistally, in general, both of them. But then when you compare the maxillary to the maxillary is a little bit bigger than the mandibular canine. It's narrower mesiodistally. Okay, the mandibular canine has a continuous convex facial surface when viewed from the mesial or distal. This is the mandibular canine, and it has a continuous convexity. That is true. You can just see how convex it is and how continuous it is. It does not stop. The mandibular canine has a cingulum that is less pronounced. True, we talked about that because the maxillary is more prominent. Often slightly to the distal, it has an off-centered cingulum, where the maxillary canine has a cingulum that is more pronounced and centered mesiodistally when you view it lingually. Okay, so this all goes back to the centered, off-centered cingulums. If you remember those, this would be super easy for you because it's nothing new. Lingual ridges with mesial and distal fossa are less prominent on mandibular canines. We already talked about that. We have the lingual ridges right over here. They're not as prominent because the cingulum is not as prominent. The lingual surface is flatter. So technically everything else is just going to be less prominent when you compare it to the maxillary. If you had a maxillary tooth in your hand right now and a mandibular one, you would see a great difference between them. Okay. All right. So to the last slide. This is another important slide. We discussed everything about the canines today in the permanent dentition, but what I want you to understand is the eruption of the canines because it really differs in kids to know if you wanted to know what age they are, let's say, okay? Because lately canines have been a problematic issue to some patients, as the canines don't always usually follow the path of eruption, and they end up like, you know, I don't know, erupting vertically or horizontally. Yeah, horizontally instead of vertically, and they just end up sitting in the roof of the mouth. So you wouldn't know what the age of the patient is. You wouldn't know if like they're missing a tooth. You wouldn't like all these factors go into it. So I just want you guys to know that maxillary canines erupt between the ages of 11 to 12 after the premolars, so it's pretty late that it's coming out. And mandibular canines erupt between the ages of 9 to 10 before the premolars. So you get the premolars that come out, and then you get the mandibular canines that erupt first between the ages of 9 to 10, and then you get the maxillary canines that erupt between the ages of 11. This is crucially important for you to know. If you have a parent that comes and asks you if any concerned, like, my kid doesn't have his canines yet, are they missing? Are they there? You would know, because you would know that they don't erupt until a specific age. Okay, so that's a good thing to know just for future reference. All right, it was a quick and short uh, lecture today. It's a lot of information. That's why I didn't want to overwhelm you today. I do have a quick question for you. In maximum intercuspation, which anterior tooth is unique in that it contacts with both anterior and posterior segments of the opposite arch? Maxillary first premolar, maxillary canine, mandibular first premolar, mandibular canine. Meaning, remember how we discussed, let's say for example, we discussed the lower central incisors when they contact at maximum intercuspation, they only contact with the maxillary central incisors because they're so tiny and they're so confined, and the maxillary centrals are so huge that they only contact with that one tooth. So in this question, I'm asking you, which anterior tooth is unique in that it contacts with both anterior and posterior segments of the opposite arch? So let's say, which anterior tooth contacts with both anterior and posterior teeth at the same time because of its unique location, its unique anatomy. Um, Let me know. And we'll talk about it more in the next lecture. The next lecture, we're going to be discussing the premolars, first and second. And we're going to be discussing as well the contact points of the teeth, especially the anterior teeth. I'm going to show you a diagram, and we're going to know each tooth contacts with what and where it's situated exactly in maximum intercuspation. Okay? All right, guys. Have a good one. See you then.